All right, second graders, it's time for chapter 4, part 3 of the Bad Table Manners Cure. In the last section of the chapter, Lester the pig was over to help Chris have better table manners. Mr. Brown said, I guess I'll go down and have a look at Lester. He went down to the basement stairs whistling. Who's afraid of the big bad wolf? Mrs. Brown groaned. Mr. Brown looked first in the wood room, no Lester. Then he looked in the furnace room. He saw the blue guest room blanket laying on the floor, so he picked it up, shook it, and took it to the laundry and stuffed it in the laundry chute. He went around the laundry chute, peering under the washing machine, laundry tubs and ironing board. Oink, oink, oink. He got to no response. He noticed that the basement door was open a little, so he closed it and locked it, muttering about burglars and carelessness. Then, hearing the radio from the game room, he decided to go in and check on Christopher, where he kept the pig. He was certainly surprised to see Lester laying on the hearth rug in front of the crackling fire, apparently listening to the radio. He said, So this is Lester, oink, oink, oink. Lester opened his eyes and gave him a cold look. Then, seeing that it was Mr. Brown, he jumped up to his feet and held out his hoof. Well, I'll be darned, said Mr. Brown, shaking hands and beaming. Christopher said, Boy, isn't Lester smart, Daddy, isn't he? Mr. Brown said, I always said that you can teach a pig anything. Pigs are the smartest animals there are. Lester still looked coldly at him. He hadn't forgiven him for the oink, oink, oink business. Mr. Brown bent over and began scratching behind Lester's ears. Lester gently but firmly pushed his hand away, then went over and laid down next to the fire. Mr. Brown, slightly red in the face, said, Well, I guess I'd better see how dinner is coming along. Christopher said, Just a minute, Daddy. I want to show you how keen Lester plays ball. Come, Lester boy, let's play a game. He picked up the red tennis ball, and Lester, rather unwillingly, got to his feet. Chris threw him the ball, and he caught it in his mouth and threw it back. Christopher threw it again, and Lester caught it, but this time Lester threw it to Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown was so surprised he almost missed it, but you could tell he was pleased because he kept looking at Lester and smiling. They played three-corner catch until Mrs. Brown called to say dinner was ready to tell Christopher to wash his hands. There was a small lavatory, also known as a bathroom, off the game room, and Christopher rushed in his usual way, wet his hands, splashed a little water on his face, and was going to wipe all the dirt off on a towel, when Lester, who had followed him in, took the towel away from him and put it back on the towel rack. But the stopper in the basin, filled it to the brim with hot water, began washing his face and hooves thoroughly with lots of soap. Then he had finished to let the water out of the basin and filled it up with fresh hot water for Christopher. While Lester dried his nice clean face and hooves, Christopher washed thoroughly and with lots of soap. While he dried his face and hands, Lester took the hairbrush and dampened it in smooth bristles on his neck and around his ears. Christopher watched him, then dampened the brush to his hair too. Then he went up to dinner. Unfortunately, Mrs. Brown, forgetting about Lester, had spare ribs for dinner. They were a little crisp and brown, and Mr. Brown gave Lester an extra large helping. Lester sat down at the table and smiled. Everything looked and smelled so delicious. Unfolded his napkin, took a sip of milk, then cut off a small piece of spare rib. He put it in his mouth, began to chew, turned terribly pale, and pushed the plate away. Christopher watched him anxiously. Gosh, Lester, what's the matter? Don't you like spare ribs? Lester took his spare ribs and put them in Christopher's plate. Christopher said, Lester, I'll go tell Mother you don't like spare ribs. She'll fry you some eggs or something. That's what she does for Daddy when he doesn't like something. He started to get down from the chair. Lester reached over and told his shoulder. He shook his head sternly and pointed to Christopher's dinner by chewing motions, indicating that Christopher was to continue his dinner. Lester had two heapings of dressing, sweet potatoes, and string beans. He also ate his salad, 2 dishes of peaches, 2 pieces of applesauce cake, and drank 4 cups of coffee. Christopher ate all of his dinner, and with much less noise than usual. He even asked Lester if it was all right to pick up his spare rib bones with his fingers. After dinner, he and Christopher and Mr. Brown played ball for a while. Then it was time for Chris to go to bed. He and Mr. Brown said good night, and Lester went upstairs. Good night to Lester, and went upstairs. Lester went to his bed, but it wasn't there. He looked all over in the basement, thinking perhaps Mr. Brown had moved it. He couldn't find any place. Then he checked to see if the back door had been left open and found it was locked. He looked again to see if he could find a blanket. It just wasn't anywhere, and he decided to go upstairs to ask Mrs. Brown where it was. He went to the basement stairs, had quite a time with a basement door, which stuck, trotted through the kitchen and dining room, and stood politely in the living room door. Mr. and Mrs. Brown were playing cribbage and arguing that they didn't see Lester for a few minutes. When Mrs. Brown happened to look up, she said, "Why, Lester, have you come to visit?" Lester shook his head. Mrs. Brown said, "What's the matter? Is it cold down in the basement?" Lester shook his head. "Oh, I know," Mr. Brown said. "You want me to come play ball with you, don't you, old boy?" Lester shook his head. Then, deciding that would be a very good way to get him down to the basement, he nodded his head vigorously several times. Mr. Brown beamed. "Okay, old boy, come down. Alice, and watch." Mrs. Brown said she'd like to, so they went downstairs. But Lester, in spite of his flawless manners, went first and insisted on going to the game room. Stood by the furnace door. Mrs. Brown looked in the furnace room. "But where's your blanket?" she said. Lester shook his head. Mr. Brown said, "Why, that's the funniest thing. I put the blue guest room blanket on the floor this afternoon. I wonder what could have happened to it." Mr. Brown, looking very embarrassed, went and got the laundry out of the chute. He said, "I didn't know it was Lester's bed. I thought it had fallen from the floor." Mrs. Brown spread it out on the floor, and Lester carefully smoothed out the wrinkles and turned one corner like a little pillow. Mr. and Mrs. Brown watched in amazement. "I've never in my life seen such a smart animal," said Mrs. Brown. "He seems almost human." Lester looked up quizzically. "Now you're all ready to go to bed. I guess we'll go upstairs," said Mr. Brown. All right, so what do you think's going to happen next? Now, they didn't open the door for Lester's exercise in the evening, so make a prediction and I'll see you next time.